The auctioneer's voice cut through the October wind like a blade, and Willa Sawyer felt every word carve into her pride as she stood on the courthouse platform with 24 men staring up at her like she was livestock. The bank had taken Star Ranch that morning. Now they were auctioning off everything she owned, including the breeding stock that had been her life's work. And the crowd had grown ugly when someone shouted that a woman alone had no business running horses anyway. She kept her chin up and her hands steady, even though her heart hammered against her ribs. The bank manager stood beside the auctioneer with a satisfied smirk. 3 church ladies whispered behind gloved hands near the post office steps. Willa had refused to marry any of the respectable men they'd pushed at her after her father died. And now, they were watching her pay for that independence. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "Do I hear 500 for the Merlot and tack?" 500 to start. Silence stretched. Willa's throat tightened. If no one bid, the bank would seize everything and sell it piecemeal in Santa Fe. She'd never see her horses again. Then a man's voice came from the back of the crowd, low and cold as a rifle barrel. 1,000. Every head turned. Willa's gaze snapped to the speaker, and her stomach dropped. She knew that voice. She knew that face. Micah Hale stood at the edge of the crowd, with his brown duster open just enough to show the gun on his hip, and the federal marshal's star pinned to his vest. He looked exactly like he had 2 years ago, when he'd ridden through Willow Bluff, chasing a fugitive, and she'd made the mistake of giving him water and directions. He'd barely spoken to her then. Now his pale eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The auctioneer blinked. 1,000 for the ladies' horses and tack. Do I hear 1,100? No one spoke. The crowd shifted uneasily. Micah Hale had a reputation. He brought in fugitives dead or alive, and he didn't stay in any town long enough to make friends. The bank manager leaned toward the auctioneer and whispered something sharp. The auctioneer cleared his throat. We also have the matter of outstanding debts on the property. The buyer would assume responsibility for. He glanced at his paper. $1,800 owed to the bank. Micah's expression didn't change. 2,800 total. Cash. Today. Willa's breath stopped. That was more than the ranch was worth. More than anyone in Willow Bluff could spare. The church ladies gasped. The bank manager's smirk faltered. The auctioneer looked between Micah and the crowd, waiting for another bid that clearly wouldn't come. Sold. To the gentleman in the duster. Pay the clerk inside and collect your. He paused awkwardly. Collect your purchase. The crowd began to disperse, muttering. Willa stood frozen on the platform as Micah walked toward the courthouse door without looking at her. Her hands shook. She didn't understand. Micah Hale was a bounty hunter. He lived on the trail. He had no reason to buy a failing ranch or a string of horses he couldn't use. And he certainly had no reason to pay off her debts. The auctioneer gestured impatiently for her to step down. She climbed off the platform on legs that felt like water. The bank manager brushed past her without a word. The church ladies hurried away, whispering furiously. Willa stood alone in the dusty street, watching the courthouse door where Micah had disappeared, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. 20 minutes later, he came back out. He had a folded paper in his hand and his face was unreadable. He walked straight to her and stopped 2 feet away. His shadow fell across her, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You need to leave town," he said. "Tonight." Willa's spine stiffened. Excuse me. You're a witness, Micah said quietly. The man I'm hunting knows it. He'll come for you before he runs. Her pulse spiked. She took a step back. I don't know what you're talking about. His jaw tightened. 2 years ago, you were in the livery stable in Red Creek when Frank Dulane shot a man over a card game. You saw his face. You saw the whole thing. He's killed 3 people since then to keep witnesses quiet. And he just found out you're still alive. Willa's throat went dry. She remembered Red Creek. She remembered the livery stable and the sound of the gunshot and the way the man had turned and looked right at her before he ran. She'd told the deputy what she'd seen, but nothing had come of it. She'd thought it was over. I testified, she said. 2 years ago. They didn't care. They care now. Micah's voice was flat. Dulane killed a federal judge in Amarillo last month. There's a warrant and a $5,000 bounty. He's desperate, and he's smart. He won't leave loose ends. Then why are you here? Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Why did you buy my ranch? Because it's the only way to keep you alive long enough to testify again. He held up the paper. This deed says, you work for me now. That makes you my responsibility. It gives me legal cover to move you and protect you without questions. Willa stared at him. You bought me. His eyes narrowed. I bought your debt and your horses. You're not property. But you're also not safe, and if you stay in Willow Bluff tonight, you'll be dead by morning. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him to leave and take his cold logic and his Marshall star and his assumptions with him. But her hands were still shaking, and her mind kept circling back to the memory of Frank Dulane's face in that stable. She'd had nightmares for months afterward. She'd moved to Willow Bluff to escape the memory. Where would we go? She asked. Micah's expression softened a fraction. There's a line shack in the hills north of here. Dulane doesn't know the area. I can keep you there until the trial. And then what? Then you testify. Dulane hangs. You get your life back. Willa looked past him at the courthouse, at the empty platform, at the town she'd tried so hard to make home. The church ladies were still watching from the post office steps. The bank manager was talking to the sheriff near the saloon. No one had helped her when the foreclosure notice came. No one had stepped in when the whispers started. Micah Hale was a stranger with a reputation for violence. But he was offering protection, and he'd just spent a fortune to make sure she had a way out. She met his eyes again. If I say yes, do I get my horses back? When it's over? Yes. She took a breath. All right. But I need to pack my things first. Micah shook his head. No time. Dulane's man was in town yesterday asking questions. We leave in an hour. Bring what you can carry and nothing else. Willa's chest tightened, but she nodded. 1 hour. He stepped back and gestured toward the livery. I'll get the horses ready. Meet me there. Don't talk to anyone. She turned and walked toward the boarding house where she'd been staying since the bank took the ranch. Her mind raced. She didn't know if she was making the right choice. She didn't know if she could trust Micah Hale. But she knew she didn't want to die in Willow Bluff. And she knew that staying would mean facing Frank Dulane alone. She packed fast. 2 changes of clothes. Her father's pocket watch. The deed to Star Ranch that was now worthless. A small revolver she'd never fired. She changed into her riding skirt and her sturdiest boots. Her hands moved automatically, but her thoughts kept snagging on Micah's words. You're a witness. He'll come for you. She'd spent 2 years trying to forget Red Creek. Now it had found her anyway. When she reached the livery, Micah had 2 horses saddled and a pack mule loaded. He took her satchel without a word and tied it down. The sun was dropping toward the western ridge, and the temperature was falling. Willa pulled her shawl tighter and climbed into the saddle. Her mare shifted beneath her, familiar and steady. Micah swung up onto a tall bay gelding and turned toward the north road. They rode out of Willow Bluff in silence. No one stopped them. No one called out. Willa looked back once and saw the church lady still standing on the post office steps, watching. She faced forward and didn't look back again. The trail climbed into the hills through scrub oak and juniper. The air smelled like dust and pine. Micah set a hard pace and didn't speak. Willa's mind churned. She kept replaying the auction. The moment Micah's voice had cut through the crowd, the cold clarity in his eyes. He'd said he was protecting her, but he was also using her. She was bait. Testimony. A means to collect a bounty. They reached the line shack just as the last light bled out of the sky. It was a rough structure built into a rock outcrop with a stone chimney and a single room. Micah dismounted and checked the perimeter before gesturing for her to go inside. Willa slid down from the saddle and her legs nearly buckled. She'd been riding for hours, and adrenaline was starting to fade into exhaustion. Inside, the shack was cold and sparse. A narrow bunk, a table, a fireplace. Micah brought in their gear and started a fire without speaking. Willa sank onto the edge of the bunk and watched him work. His movements were efficient and controlled. He didn't waste motion. When the fire caught, he straightened and finally looked at her. There's beans and cornbread in the pack. I'll take first watch. Willa's voice came out hoarse. You think he'll find us tonight? No. But I don't take chances. She nodded slowly. Why did you really buy the ranch? Micah's expression didn't change. I told you. Legal cover. That's not an answer. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I knew your father. We served in the same unit during the war. He asked me once to look after you if anything happened to him. I didn't get back in time to help when he died. This is me keeping that promise. Willa's chest tightened. Her father had never mentioned Micah Hale. But she remembered the war had changed him, left him quiet and distant. She'd been too young to understand then. Now, she wondered what kind of bond had been forged in that violence that would make a man honor a promise years later. Thank you, she said quietly. Micah's jaw flexed. Don't thank me yet. We still have to get you to the trial alive. He turned and walked outside. Willa heard his boots on the stone, and then silence. She sat in the firelight and tried to steady her breathing. Everything had shifted in the span of a day. This morning she'd been facing ruin. Tonight she was hiding in the hills with a bounty hunter who'd known her father and who looked at her like she was a problem to solve. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if she could trust him. But she was alive, and for now, that had to be enough. She ate a little cornbread and wrapped herself in a blanket on the bunk. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside made her tense. The fire burned low. Sometime near midnight, Micah came back inside and sat at the table. She watched him through half-closed eyes. He didn't lie down. He just sat with his rifle across his knees and his gaze on the door, and Willa realized he meant to stay awake all night. Morning came cold and sharp. Willa woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Micah moving around the shack. She sat up stiffly and pushed her hair back. He handed her a tin cup without speaking. She wrapped her hands around it and drank. The coffee was bitter and strong. "We'll stay here today," Micah said. "Move again after dark. Dulane's people will be watching the roads." Willa nodded. "How long until the trial?" 3 weeks. Maybe 4. Depends on when they bring him in. And if they don't bring him in..." Micah's eyes met hers. "Then I go get him. But you stay here until it's done." She wanted to argue that she wasn't helpless, that she'd been managing her own life just fine before he appeared. But the truth was, she had no idea how to fight a man like Frank Dulane. She had no training, no experience. Micah did. So she swallowed her pride and nodded. The day stretched out long and tense. Micah checked the perimeter twice. He cleaned his guns. He barely spoke. Willa tried to keep busy. She mended a tear in her skirt. She reorganized the supplies. She felt caged and useless. By mid-afternoon, she couldn't stand it anymore. She walked outside and found Micah standing near the horses, scanning the ridgeline. She stopped beside him and crossed her arms. "Tell me about my father," she said. Micah glanced at her. "What do you want to know? What he was like during the war? What he didn't tell me when he came home?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He was steady. Kept his head when everyone else panicked. Saved my life twice. He didn't talk much about what he saw because he didn't want to bring it home to you." Willa's throat tightened. "Did he ask you to watch over me because he thought I couldn't manage alone?" "No. He asked because he knew what kind of men are out there. He wanted you to have someone who'd step in if things went bad." "That's not about weakness. That's about love." She looked away. Her eyes burned. She hadn't cried when her father died. She hadn't cried when the bank took the ranch. But standing in the cold wind with Micah's quiet words settling over her, something cracked. Micah shifted. His voice softened. "You're stronger than you think. Your father knew that. I see it too." She blinked hard and nodded. "Thank you." They stood in silence for a while. The wind moved through the pines. A hawk circled overhead. Willa felt the tension in her chest ease a fraction. Micah wasn't warm. He wasn't easy. But he was honest. And right now, that mattered more than comfort. That night, they moved again. Micah led them higher into the hills along a narrow game trail. The moon was nearly full, and the landscape looked silver and strange. Willa's mare picked her way carefully over loose rock. Micah rode ahead, his silhouette sharp against the sky. They reached a second shack near dawn. This one was even smaller, built into a cliff face with a spring nearby. Micah checked it thoroughly before letting her inside. Willa was so tired, she could barely see straight. She collapsed onto the bunk and fell asleep still wearing her boots. When she woke, the sun was high, and Micah was gone. Panic spiked through her chest. She grabbed her revolver and stepped outside. He was sitting on a flat rock 20 feet away with his rifle in his lap and his eyes on the valley below. Relief flooded her. She walked over and sat down beside him. He glanced at her, but didn't speak. She followed his gaze. The valley stretched out in golden autumn light. It was beautiful and empty. "Do you ever stay anywhere?" she asked. Micah's mouth twitched. "Not often." "Why not?" He was quiet. Then he said, "I tried once. After the war. Settled in Kansas. Had a piece of land. A woman who said she'd wait for me. But I couldn't let go of the work. Couldn't stop seeing the things that needed fixing. She got tired of waiting. Left. I sold the land and went back to hunting fugitives. It's what I'm good at." Willa studied his profile. His jaw was tight. His eyes were distant. She recognized that look. It was the same one her father had worn. "You think you don't deserve to stay," she said quietly. Micah's gaze snapped to hers. His expression was hard. "I think I'm better at catching bad men than I am at being a good one. That's not the same thing." He looked away. "Maybe not. But it's true, either way." Willa's chest ached. She wanted to argue, but she didn't know him well enough to push. So she just sat beside him in the sunlight and let the silence stretch. After a while, he stood and walked back toward the shack. She watched him go and wondered what it cost a man to live like that. Always moving, never landing. The next few days fell into a pattern. They moved at night. They hid during the day. Micah kept watch. Willa tried to make herself useful. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them started to feel less like distance and more like understanding. On the fourth night, everything changed. They were camped in a narrow canyon when Micah went still and held up a hand. Willa froze. He gestured for her to stay quiet and moved toward the canyon mouth with his rifle raised. She heard it then. Hoofbeats. Slow and deliberate. Someone was tracking them. Micah turned back to her. His voice was barely a whisper. "Stay down. If shooting starts, you run. Understand?" Willa's heart hammered. "I'm not leaving you." His eyes blazed. "You will, if I tell you to. This isn't negotiable." She wanted to argue, but the look on his face stopped her. She nodded. Micah moved forward again. The hoofbeats stopped. Silence pressed down. Then a voice called out from the darkness. "Hale, I know you're in there. Send the woman out, and I'll let you ride away." Willa's blood went cold. She recognized that voice. Frank Dulane. Micah's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. The voice came again, harder this time. "I got 3 men with me. You got 1 rifle and a woman who can't shoot. Do the math." Micah glanced back at Willa. His expression was grim. He mouthed one word. "Run." Then he stepped out into the open and fired. The canyon exploded with sound. Willa's ears rang. She saw muzzle flashes. Heard men shouting. Micah dove behind a boulder and fired again. She couldn't see how many men were out there. She couldn't see if he was hit. Her hands shook. She looked at the horses. She could run. Micah had told her to run. But if she left him, he'd die trying to buy her time. She'd seen enough death. She wasn't going to watch another person sacrifice themselves for her. She took a breath and raised her revolver. Her father had taught her to shoot, but she'd never aimed at a person. Her hand steadied. She sighted on a shadow moving near the canyon entrance and pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted her arm. The shadow dropped. Someone cursed. Micah glanced back at her with something like shock on his face. "I told you to run," he shouted. "I don't take orders well," she shouted back. Another shot rang out. Rock chips sprayed near her head. She ducked and fired again. Micah moved fast, using the distraction. He took down another man. 2 left. Maybe 3. Willa's pulse roared in her ears. She reloaded with shaking hands. Micah fired twice more. Then, silence fell. He stayed behind the boulder for a long moment. Then he rose slowly, rifle still raised. Willa held her breath. No one shot. Micah moved toward the canyon entrance and checked the bodies. When he came back, his face was hard. Dulane ran. The other 2 are dead. We need to move now. He'll come back with more men. Willa stood on shaking legs. "Are you hurt?" "No." "You." She shook her head. Micah grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the horses. His grip was firm but not rough. They mounted fast and rode hard into the darkness. Willa's mind was spinning. She just shot a man. Maybe killed him. Her stomach turned, but she forced it down. There was no time to fall apart. They rode until dawn, pushing the horses to the edge of endurance. When they finally stopped, they were high in the mountains near a creek. Micah dismounted and checked the trail behind them. Willa slid down and her legs gave out. She sat hard on the ground. Micah turned and crouched beside her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, but her hands were still shaking. Micah took her revolver gently and checked it. Then he handed it back. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "I won't forget that." Willa met his eyes. "You saved mine first." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, barely there, but Willa saw it. The hard mask cracked a fraction. He looked at her like he was seeing someone real instead of a problem to solve. Then he stood and offered his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. For a moment, they stood close, his hand still wrapped around hers. Neither of them moved. Then, Micah let go and stepped back. "We'll rest here for an hour. Then we keep moving." They reached the town of Bitter Springs 2 days later. It was a small mining settlement with a telegraph office and a federal marshal station. Micah sent a wire to Santa Fe and got a reply within the hour. The trial was set for 10 days out. Frank Dulane was still at large, but federal marshals were closing in. Willa would be kept in protective custody until she testified. Micah found them a room above the general store. It had 2 narrow beds and a window overlooking the street. Willa sank onto one of the beds and finally let herself feel the weight of the last week. Her body ached. Her mind was numb. Micah stood by the window with his arms crossed, watching the street. "You should eat something," he said. "So should you." He didn't answer. Willa studied him. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His jaw was tight. She realized he hadn't slept more than a few hours since they left Willow Bluff. He'd been keeping watch every night, putting himself between her and danger without hesitation. "Micah," she said. He glanced at her. "What?" "Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over." "I'm fine." "You're not." "Sit." He hesitated, then crossed to the other bed and sat. He didn't relax. Willa leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "The truth this time. Not the promise to my father. Not the legal cover." "Why?" Micah's gaze locked on hers. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he said, "Because when I rode through Willow Bluff 2 years ago, you looked at me like I was still a person instead of a gun for hire. You gave me water. You didn't ask questions. You didn't judge. And when I heard you were in danger, I couldn't walk away." Willa's breath caught. "That's it. That's enough." His voice was rough. "I don't have family. I don't have a home. I don't have much worth protecting. But you do. And if I can keep you alive long enough to get it back, then maybe I'm not just the man who brings in bodies." Her chest ached. She wanted to tell him he was more than that already. She wanted to reach across the space between them and touch his hand. But she didn't know if he'd let her. So she just said, "Thank you. For everything." He nodded once. Then he stood and walked back to the window. Willa lay down and closed her eyes. Her mind was too full to sleep, but exhaustion dragged her under anyway. The next week passed slowly. Micah kept them inside most of the time. He only went out to check with the marshal and buy supplies. Willa felt like a prisoner again, but she understood the precaution. Frank Dulain was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until she was dead or he was caught. On the 8th day, word came that Dulain had been spotted near the Colorado border. Federal marshals were in pursuit. Micah's tension eased a fraction, but he didn't let his guard down. They stayed in the room. They played cards. They talked. Slowly, the walls between them started to come down. Willa learned that Micah had grown up in Missouri, that he'd lost his parents young, that the war had been the only family he'd known. He learned that she'd raised horses since she was a girl, that her father had taught her everything, that losing Star Ranch had felt like losing him all over again. One night, she asked him what he'd do after the trial. He was quiet. Then he said, "I'll go back to work. There's always another fugitive. And if there wasn't, if you could choose," he looked at her. His expression was unreadable. "I don't know. I've never thought that far ahead." "You should," she said. "You deserve more than just surviving. So do you." Their eyes held. Something passed between them, unspoken but real. Willa felt her pulse quicken. Micah leaned forward slightly, then stopped himself. He stood abruptly and walked to the window. Willa's chest tightened. She wanted to call him back. She wanted to ask him to stay, but she didn't know if he'd say yes. The day of the trial arrived cold and clear. Micah escorted Willa to the courthouse in Santa Fe, with 2 federal marshals flanking them. Frank Dulain had been captured the night before. He was in custody, and the trial was moving forward fast. Willa took the stand and told the court exactly what she'd seen in Red Creek 2 years ago. Frank Dulain sat at the defense table with his hands shackled, and his eyes locked on her the whole time. She didn't look away. She spoke, clearly. She didn't falter. When the prosecutor finished, the defense attorney tried to shake her story. He couldn't. The judge called a recess. Micah met her outside the courtroom. "You did good," he said. She nodded, but her hands were shaking. "It's not over yet. It will be. The jury won't take long." He was right. 2 hours later, the verdict came back. Guilty on all counts. Frank Dulain would hang. Willa felt the tension drain out of her body. Micah's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, then dropped away. They walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun. "You're free now," Micah said. "You can go back to Willow Bluff. Get your ranch running again." Willa stopped walking. "And you?" "I'll head north. There's a job waiting in Cheyenne." She turned to face him. Her chest felt tight. "So that's it. You just leave." Micah's jaw flexed. "That was the deal. I didn't agree to any deal. I agreed to survive. And I did. We did. Together." His eyes searched hers. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want you to go." Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. "I know you think you're just good at catching bad men. I know you think you don't deserve to stay anywhere. But you're wrong. You're good at a lot more than that. You're patient. You're steady. You keep your promises. And when you look at me, I don't feel like a problem. I feel like I matter." Micah took a step closer. His voice was rough. "You do matter. Then stay. Help me rebuild the ranch. Give yourself a chance to have more than just the next fugitive. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I. But we can figure it out. Together." He looked at her for a long moment. His guard was down. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the fear and the want tangled together. Then he reached out and cupped her face with one hand. His thumb brushed her cheek. His voice was barely a whisper. "If I stay, I won't leave again." "Good," she said. "I don't want you to." He kissed her then, slow and careful, like he was memorizing the moment. Willa's hands fisted in his shirt, and she kissed him back. When they broke apart, Micah rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "Neither am I." He smiled. It was small and fleeting, but it was real. "All right. We'll try." They returned to Willow Bluff a week later. The church ladies whispered when they saw Micah and Willa riding in together. But Willa didn't care. The ranch was still hers. The horses were waiting. Micah had kept his word. The first month was hard. The ranch needed work. Fences were down. The barn roof leaked. Micah wasn't used to staying in one place. And sometimes Willa caught him staring at the horizon like he was calculating an escape route. But he didn't leave. He fixed the fences. He patched the roof. He worked beside her every day. And slowly, the tension in his shoulders started to ease. One evening, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Micah said, "Your father would be proud of you." Willa leaned against his shoulder. "I think he'd be glad you kept your promise." Micah's arm came around her. "I'm glad I did too." Winter came hard that year. Snow piled high in the hills, and the temperature dropped below freezing for weeks. Micah and Willa spent long nights by the fire, talking and planning. She taught him about breeding horses. He taught her to track game. They argued sometimes. They disagreed on details. But they didn't walk away. They stayed. By spring, Star Ranch was running again. The first foals were born healthy. The town started to accept that Micah Hale wasn't just passing through. The church ladies stopped whispering. The bank manager nodded when he saw them in town. Willa felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt settled. She felt home. One warm April morning, Micah found her in the barn checking on a new mare. He leaned against the stall door and watched her work. When she looked up, he was smiling. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. Just thinking." "About what?" "About how I spent 10 years moving from one place to another, and it took you less than 6 months to make me want to stay." Willa walked over and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You're not the only one who changed. I spent 2 years trying to prove I didn't need anyone. Turns out, I was wrong." Micah kissed the top of her head. "We're both stubborn. Good thing we're stubborn together." They stood like that for a long moment, the morning sun slanting through the barn doors and the horses moving quietly in their stalls. Willa closed her eyes and let herself feel it. This was home. Not the ranch, not the town. This. The man holding her. The life they were building. The choice they made every day to stay. That summer, they got married. It was a small ceremony at the ranch with the circuit preacher and a handful of friends. Willa wore her mother's dress. Micah wore a new vest and looked uncomfortable the whole time. When the preacher said they could kiss, Micah pulled her close and whispered, "I never thought I'd have this." "You do now," she whispered back. "Don't forget it." "I won't." The years that followed weren't easy. Ranching never was. There were droughts and hard winters. There were injuries and setbacks. But Micah and Willa faced them together. They built Star Ranch into something strong and lasting. They raised horses that people came from 3 territories to buy. They proved that 2 stubborn, scarred people could make a life that mattered. On quiet evenings, Micah still sat on the porch and watched the horizon. But now, Willa sat beside him, her hand in his. And when she asked what he was thinking, he'd smile and say, "Just grateful." "For what?" "For you. For this. For getting to stay." Willa would lean her head on his shoulder and close her eyes. "Me too," she'd say. "Me too." One autumn afternoon 5 years later, Willa was in the corral, working with a young stallion, when a rider came up the road. Micah stepped out of the barn with his hand near his gun, then relaxed. The rider was a young federal marshal. He dismounted and handed Micah a letter. "Thought you'd want to know," the marshal said. "Frank Dulane's brother just got arrested in Denver. He had a list of people he planned to go after. Your wife's name was on it." Micah's jaw tightened. "Where is he now?" "Federal custody. He'll hang same as his brother." "Good." Micah folded the letter. "Thanks for the warning." The marshal nodded and rode off. Willa walked over, wiping her hands on her skirt. She'd heard the whole conversation. Micah looked at her, his expression grim. "It's over," he said. "Really over." Willa took his hand. "It's been over for a long time. We just didn't know it yet." He pulled her close. "I'm still glad I bought that ranch." She smiled against his chest. "So am I." They stood together in the autumn light, the horses moving quietly in the corral, and the wind whispering through the dry grass. The past was behind them. The future stretched out wide and open. And they had each other. That was enough. That was everything. The final test came in the spring of their 6th year together. Willa discovered she was pregnant. She told Micah one evening after supper, and he went still, his face drained of color. She took his hand. "Say something," she said. "I don't know how to be a father." "You didn't know how to be a rancher either. You figured it out. This is different." "I know." But we'll figure it out together. Same as everything else. Micah pulled her close and held on tight. His voice was rough. I'm scared. So am I. But I want this. I want it with you. He nodded against her hair. All right. We'll do it. Their daughter was born in December, just before Christmas. She had Willa's dark eyes and Micah's stubborn chin. They named her Rose. Micah held her for the first time with shaking hands and tears running down his face. Willa watched him and felt her heart expand. You're doing fine, she said softly. He looked at her. I never thought I'd have this. A family. A home. Something worth protecting that wasn't just a job. You have it now. Don't let it go. I won't. His voice was fierce. I swear I won't. Rose grew strong and healthy. She learned to walk in the ranch yard. She learned to ride before she turned 3. Micah taught her to track animals and read the weather. Willa taught her to gentle horses and speak softly. The ranch thrived. The town accepted them fully. The past became just that. The past and the future opened wide. 10 years after the auction, Willa stood on the porch of Star Ranch and watched the sunset. Micah sat beside her with Rose on his knee, telling her a story about a hawk he'd seen that morning. The horses grazed in the pasture. The hills rolled out golden and endless. Willa felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Micah glanced at her. What are you thinking? That I'm glad you stayed. He smiled. Me too. Rose tugged on his sleeve. Tell me the story about when you met Mama. Micah's eyes met Willa's. That's a long story. I want to hear it. Rose insisted. All right. Micah shifted her on his knee. It started at an auction. Your mama was in trouble, and I didn't know it yet, but I was about to make the best decision of my life. Willa leaned against his shoulder and listened as he told their daughter the story. He left out the danger and the fear. He kept the parts about courage and choice, and the way 2 stubborn people decided to trust each other. Rose listened with wide eyes. When he finished, she looked up at Willa. Did you know you were going to marry him? Willa smiled. Not at first. But I figured it out. How? Because he stayed when he didn't have to. And because when I looked at him, I saw home. Micah's arm came around her. That goes both ways. Rose wrinkled her nose. That's mushy. They both laughed. Micah set Rose down, and she ran off to play with the barn cat. Willa and Micah stayed on the porch, watching the light fade. The air smelled like pine and hay. The stars were starting to come out. Do you ever miss it? Willa asked. The bounty hunting. The road. Sometimes, Micah said honestly. But not enough to leave. Good. Because I'd come after you if you did. He grinned. I know you would. They sat in comfortable silence as the night settled in. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote called. The horses shifted in the barn. Rose's laughter echoed from the yard. Willa closed her eyes and felt the fullness of it. The life they'd built from nothing but stubbornness and trust. And a choice made on a dusty auction platform 10 years ago. Micah's hand found hers. Still glad I bought that ranch. Still glad you did. They stayed like that until the stars filled the sky and Rose came back tired and ready for bed. Micah carried her inside. Willa followed. They tucked Rose in together and stood in the doorway watching her sleep. Then they walked to their own room, hand in hand, and lay down in the quiet darkness. Thank you. Micah whispered. For what? For not giving up on me. Willa turned toward him. I never did. And I never will. He pulled her close. The night settled around them, warm and safe. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The horses slept. The ranch stood solid. And two people who'd started as strangers, bound by danger and duty, lay together in the home they'd built and knew they'd found exactly where they belonged.